All right. Well, hello, everybody. Hope you guys are doing well. This will be our last video notes for the semester. Um, if we had have been in class, we would have gotten further along, and we would have gotten more done. We'd have gotten into World War II. Uh, some of you guys I know might be disappointed we're not going to cover World War II, but what I'll tell you is when we do U.S. history, we're going to cover World War II in more detail than normal to make up for not talking about it this particular year. But I didn't want to overwhelm you guys with notes while you guys were at home. So we didn't get quite that far. For this day in history, I would like you to still do that for the first thing on your notes. So it is May 6th. So for May 6th, put something that was important that happened on this day in history and a famous birthday from this day in history. So we're going to finish up and we're finally going to look at how the Nazis seized power. And then we're going to look very, very, very briefly at a couple things after that that happened in Germany to help consolidate the power for the most part and the Nazis' first openly show of aggression towards Jewish people as well. So we're going to look at some of those things today. So when we left off, Hitler was not chancellor. Uh, he had at one time been offered chancellorship, but he didn't take it because he knew he couldn't keep it at that point in time. He'd been offered the vice chancellorship, which he did not want. Um, so we're going to continue that story. Um, I want you to remember Schleicher was a general in the military, but we're going to be talking today about how he becomes chancellor, so he'll come back up. But one of the things we need to look at before we move on is there's a contrast between, say, communism and fascism, or what you might call Nazism in Germany. And it's the difference between statism and corporatism. This is kind of a governmental thing. In statism, like communism, in their economic policy, the state literally takes over business. There is no private ownership of land. There's no private ownership of business. Whereas the Nazis and fascism in general look instead to make a partnership with industry and business in what you would call a corporatist state. Now, this does mean that the state still has a big say over what private businesses do, but that those businesses could be privately owned. So it's still mostly government control of the business sector and the economic sector. But one is complete government takeover, that would be communism, and one is a partnership between business, especially big business, and the government, and that is called corporatism. So just so you understand the difference there. In the short run, what big industrialists wanted for the German government was to crush the labor movement. Okay, and this is something that, interestingly, we're going to see this coming up soon. But the communists actually also did not like the labor movement. The social democrats did like the labor movement, but so you're looking at the Nazis who are trying to work with big industry are willing to try to crush the labor movement, and the communists themselves kind of want to crush the labor movement because they actually were against it. It was really only a section uh, of the population that was for the labor movement. Well, neither Schleicher nor von Papen wanted to step aside. Von Papen was the chancellor, but Schleicher was the guy who kind of had the ear of Hindenburg and had a lot of power. So in December of 1932, he got Hindenburg to name him as the new chancellor. He did it through blackmail. He said that he would make public a government report of how land-owning Prussian aristocrats had been taking state funds for themselves. He even implicated that Hindenburg was involved in the scandal. Well, this actually is going to give Hitler the opening he needs. He met secretly with Von Papen at the home of the Berlin baker. Hitler did, and a few top industrialists were present. By the end of the meeting, the Nazi Party's debts were mysteriously paid. So basically, We don't know exactly what happened in that meeting. We know a few things about it, but Hitler had gained support of big industry, and Van Papen, who was mad at Schleicher, was at least willing to help Hitler out of more revenge than the fact that he actually supported Hitler. Goebbels was right, as Chancellor Schleicher had suddenly begun working with the labor movement. Big business interests were outraged, pressured by the industrialists, who he had promised to bury with any charges against the general. Hindenburg summoned Hitler to the presidential palace in January of 1933. And when he emerged from Hindenburg's office, talking about Hitler, he was the new chancellor of Germany. Now, this does not mean that Hitler's got complete control yet, but this is the first step towards his plan. This does mean that Schleicher was the chancellor for only about 2 months, because he became chancellor at the beginning of December, and Hitler became the new chancellor at the end of January. So about 2 months is all Schleicher was the chancellor. One of the reasons Hindenburg was willing to name Hitler chancellor, and Van Papen was even okay with naming Hitler chancellor, was that most of the cabinet members had been appointed by Van Papen and Schleicher, and they saw no reason why they shouldn't be able to control Hitler because of those cabinet members, because those people clearly weren't Nazis. However, they obviously are going to be mistaken. For one, the position of the political left. Now, I've argued in these things with you even that I also think the Nazis were a part of the political left. But the other political left-leaning parties, the ones that were prevalent in Germany at this point in time, were the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party. But here's the problem: these two groups could not unite. If the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party could have united, maybe, and I'm not saying that would have been a good thing, but the Nazis aren't a good thing. But maybe they could have stopped Hitler and the Nazis. The Nazis had some support from the German Nationalist Party. But when you combine the German Nationalist Party and the Nazi Party, and when you combine the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party, they were about even in numbers. The Nazis might have had a slight advantage, but it would have been a pretty small advantage. Problem is, the Social Democrats and the Communists could not see eye to eye on a lot of different issues. The Communists, we already talked about, did not like labor unions. They despised them, because Lenin despised them as well. The Social Democratic Party, however, was very much in favor of the organizing of trade unions and labor unions. And they had a huge backing from those unions. In fact, there was such a divide between these two parties, which have some similarities, that one of the German communist leaders said there's no difference between the fascist dictatorship and bourgeoisie dictatorship. Indeed, he even preferred the Nazis to the Social Democrats. He said that at least under Nazi rule, he would know who the enemy was. So either way, he thought the Social Democrats would create a dictatorship of business leaders who were running unions, whereas the fascists would be their own type of dictatorship. So he didn't really like the Social Democrats. Also, the problem too is the Nazis had now gained financing of big business, and the socialists and communists were poor, meaning they did not have a lot of financial backing. They did not have a lot of support, partly because the people who had been most hit by the Great Depression, who were the unemployed people, were the ones who supported kind of the communists and the Social Democrats, but they didn't have the funds to give to them. So the socialists and communists are divided and poor. Not a good combination to take on a well-funded political movement that the Nazis had by this point in time. No sooner had Hitler received his appointment than the stormtroopers in Hitler's SS were assembled in Berlin parks and gardens, preparing for a triumphal march through the Brandenburg Gate. The marchers appeared in huge numbers, first in front of the Communist Party headquarters, not because they were going to take them out yet, but because they were gloating over what was going on. They had good reason to gloat. Hitler had outmaneuvered President Hindenburg, and by having him made chancellor. Now, Hitler was made chancellor with a condition that he could gain a majority in the Reichstag, which means put together a majority government that could actually function, because the Nazis still were not a majority. And even with the nationalists who did support them, they still were not a majority party. They didn't have enough support to have over 50%. Now, Hitler might have got a majority if he could have formed an alliance with the Catholic Center Party, but he didn't want them, and they didn't want him. So he did not do that. So instead, he asked for Hindenburg to dissolve the Reichstag and call on a new election. Hindenburg, by this point, was pretty senile and pliant. He really honestly wasn't all there. He was getting so old. So the new elections were called for in March of 1933. So Hitler becomes chancellor the end of January 1933. So within a month and 5 days, there was going to be a new election. Goebbels was overjoyed. He said now it would be easy. He would use all sources, and the resources would now be coming from the state, since the Nazis had gained so much power within the state. Radio and press were something that the Nazis would use. He said, "We shall stage a masterpiece of propaganda," and now they have no lack of money. Okay, so they would just use propaganda galore to try to gain a majority through the election. To make sure the money continued to flow, Hitler called Göring, Hermann Göring, who had been made president of the Reichstag, into his office with a group of big business leaders. And Hitler, in a long speech, said that private enterprise cannot be maintained in democracy. It is conceivable only if the people have a sound idea of authority and personality. So he's telling these business leaders, if we continue this path that we're on government-wise, your private enterprise eventually will go away. But if you choose to back us, we will make sure to back you once we are in government power. He also talked about eliminating socialist and communist menace in the society. And he was actually talking about this being the last election, if the Nazis come to power, the last election for 10 years or maybe even 100 years. And he also promised that he would come to power either through this means or through some other means. So the businessmen during this meeting coughed up 3 million marks to help the Nazi propaganda for the next election. Despite by other means, Hitler did and the Nazis were determined to try to come to power legitimately. They didn't want it to be seen as an illegal seizure and takeover. Goebbels had said in his diary, quote, "In a conference with the Fuhrer, we lay down the line for the fight against the Reds. For the moment, we shall abstain from direct countermeasures. The Bolshevik attempt on revolution must first burn into flames. At the proper moment, we will strike." So what they really were wanting was for the socialists and communists to strike first, so that the Nazis could appear to be defending the government, saying, hey, we're striking out against these people who are being extremely radical. They want clear justification. However, Nazis were able to persuade Hindenburg to issue a decree suppressing civil liberties. They restricted free speech and the press and outlawed assembly in public places except by permission. It allowed the police to read private letters and other papers, obviously going 100% against what the U.S. Bill of Rights would be talking about. So they began to restrict civil liberties. Pursuant to Hindenburg's edict, German authorities under Hitler censored the communist press and broke up communist meetings. Nazi thugs disbanded social democratic rallies and smashed their printing press. Even the Catholic Center Party came on bad times, as they even beat up a Catholic leader who tried to speak to his followers. Though the Nazi Party was literally beating down other parties, the socialists and the communists did not counterattack. There was no uprising. amongst those. So they did not get the hoped, you know, fight from the socialists and communists that would give the Nazis a reason to fight openly. Um, but they continue the restriction of civil liberties, which is very important to understand. Then an event happens. This is on the night of February 27th. So this is before that next election, but just about a week before the next election occurs. But on February 27th, 1933, the Reichstag building where the German parliament would meet burned. And we're talking, not talking a small fire, we're talking it burned into flames, and um, not much would remain. It would completely have to be rebuilt. Uh, when Hitler and Goebbels heard about this, they were having dinner together. They drove their car very fast through Berlin to the scene of the burning building. When Hitler and Goebbels reached the scene, Hermann Goering was already there. Hermann Goering was yelling, quote, "This is the beginning of the communist revolution. We must not wait a minute. We must show no mercy." Moments later, Nazi agents were breaking down the front doors of a known communist leaders and trucking them off to concentration camps. The next day, Nazi newspapers were blaming the fire specifically on a Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe. You're not going to need to know that for the test. Van der Lubbe was indeed known to be an arsonist from the past, yet he was desperately poor at this point in time in his life and would not possibly been able to afford the equipment or fuel necessary for the catastrophic blaze. It certainly was not an accidental fire. It certainly was something that an arsonist did. Someone did start the fire. On top of that, van der Lubbe was mentally disabled at this point in time. Um, to this day, no one knows who started the fire. It possibly could have been communists who were discouraged and upset, but it also could have been started by the Nazis themselves as a way to try to seize power. The point is, no matter what happened, um, what the Nazis did was they blamed the communists, they arrested communists, which did take out a lot of their political opposition. Um, they began to centralize power and take power from their state governments and give it all to the national governments as a result. So the Nazis, whether they caused this fire or not, they took advantage of it and used it as a tool to gain power. And many people bought into the idea that the communists were the ones who did start this fire. Well, this election that occurs March 5th, 1933, finally happens. And despite all the intimidation, all the propaganda, all the money spent, the Nazis still fall short of having a true majority. But they do have 44% of the vote. That means they'll have 44% of the representatives in the new German government. Combine that with the Nationalist Party voters, they still had a slight majority of the seats in the Reichstag, so they're over 50% with that. However, that's a very small majority, and that would be enough to get through some routine government operations. But Hitler wanted more because it would be hard to push through more of his agenda if he only has barely over 50%. Nazi thugs did round up and throw more communists and social democrats into jail, especially their big leaders. This gave Hitler an overwhelming majority. So he actually throws people in jail who were elected into the government, uh, tying them possibly to the burning of the Reichstag, to other uprisings, whatever fictitious things Hitler wants to make up to say that they were trying to overthrow the government. On March 24th, when the remaining members of the Reichstag finally gathered in a temporary meeting place, Hitler gave his opening speech. He called for an enabling act to provide the Reichstag would turn over all functions of leadership to Hitler, with the SS and the SA. So you remember those two groups. I didn't mention this last time, but the SA was known for wearing brown shirts. We talked about that. But the SS was known for wearing black. They were outside the opera house where they were meeting, and also gathered around inside. This did cause the opposition to kind of just out of fear, decided to agree with the Nazi Party. So the Catholic Center Party voted for the legislation to basically make Hitler supreme leader. Germany was no longer a parliamentary democracy, it was now a dictatorship. Now, it's not completely official. You still have Paul von Hindenburg in charge, but Hitler wants to do a ceremonial passing of the power and a ceremonial meeting, and it's going to be filmed so Germans can watch it to show that he is now the unquestioned leader. So they agree to meet at a church, the Garrison Church in Potsdam, which is in Germany, but it's in the Prussian part of Germany. This would be the palace at one point in time of Kaiser Wilhelm II. The bones of Frederick the Great, who was considered the most celebrated Prussian monarch, was buried there. This is also where Otto von Bismarck came to celebrate the beginning of the German unification. So it's a symbolically important place in Germany. Even the date of the ceremony, March 21st, 1933, had its symbolic significance. It was on that date in 1871 that Bismarck first opened the all-German Reichstag. So the symbolism was definitely there. They have a ceremony in which Hindenburg, bestows upon Hitler, who seems humble and contrite, the mantle of leading Germany. This is obviously Nazi banners everywhere, movie cameras, Goebbels placed microphones so they could bring it to a German movie theater, show images of Hitler uniting the old and the new parts of Germany. Hitler here proclaims the creation of the Third Reich, and he said that it would endure for 1,000 years. He's going to be slightly off. The Third Reich, which starts here in 1933, is going to end in 1945. It's going to last 12 years, not 1,000. Hitler's death, not Hitler's death, that comes a little bit later. This is over a year after this meeting, but it's significant that Hindenburg did die August 2nd, 1934. Hitler was pretty much in power already, but once Hindenburg dies, it's official because Hitler, who's in charge of the government, then melds the office of the Chancellor and President into one person, which makes Hitler now the commander-in-chief of the armed forces as well as the leader of the government. Because when Hindenburg was alive, Hindenburg was technically the one in charge of the armed forces. So, August 2nd, 1934, there is literally no challenge now to Hitler in government. He's not even virtually the dictator. He is now the dictator and the leader of Germany, and his Nazis are now in complete control and complete power. Okay, that's how the Nazis come to power. Obviously, a lot of things had to be lined up for that to happen. I hope you can see, without the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I, which has been a long time since we talked about that, but without that, remember, it punished Germany so bad. It made Germans willing to look towards someone who, like Hitler, who wanted to take on that treaty and say, hey, we got to get rid of this because it treated them terribly, which it was a very bad treaty. But if you remember, we were talking just probably last week, I think it was. In 1929, Germany was starting to do better. Their economy was getting better, and the Nazi support was really small and getting worse. So another thing that made Hitler possible was the Great Depression, because it hit the United States, but it hit the rest of the world, and it caused Germany to go back into some very poor financial times, which caused people to look towards someone to try to fix their problems. And really, the two options, and this was mentioned in the video from quite a while ago you guys watched, but the two options were you could either support the Nazis or the communists. Those were the two groups that were the biggest on trying to change what was going on. So people began to turn to those two extremes. Hitler comes to power through all these means, but there were certainly specific events in history that helped enable this to happen in the first place. Hitler was a very gifted speaker. He was a shrewd politician. But honestly, you probably could have looked at it. Remember, we talked about his childhood. He wanted to be an artist or an architect. He was a homeless person pretty much for a while. I mean, when he was in the military, he was brave, but he didn't show any like incredible military leadership. He didn't become like a general or a colonel or even an officer for that matter. He was only a corporal by the time he was out of World War II. Uh, he's definitely not someone you think probably would have become a world leader ever. But he had a couple of skills and was in the right place at the right time with all the right circumstances going on. That's a big part of how Hitler came to power. Now, after Hitler comes to power, this is going to be real brief, but a couple other things. In order to consolidate his power, now this was not against political opponents, this was against people within his own Nazi party. But you remember you had the SA and the SS, and at one point in time, the SS replaced the SA, but the SA was still around. It just wasn't as important as had been early on. Well, on the night of June 30th, 1934, Hitler decided to take out the SA completely and say, we're done with the SA, because the SA was too independent from Hitler, and they were kind of doing their own thing. So, on what was known as the Night of Knives, over 100 Nazi party members, mostly part of the SA, were murdered. One of them was Ernst Röhm, who had been a supporter of Hitler pretty much from the beginning, but was kind of the leader of the SA and had grown out of favor with Hitler. So, an important political move, I guess you would say, as far as consolidating power under Hitler was the Night of Long Knives. Let me actually talk about the Gestapo here before we talk about Kristallnacht. The Gestapo was a part of the SS, but they were considered the secret police. They would arrest anybody who spoke out against the Nazis or who didn't get on board with what the Nazis were doing. In fact, in the video that you guys watched several weeks ago, and the one we discussed about the rise of the Third Reich, you guys remember the girls talking about getting pregnant. Uh, she said she would report her parents to the Gestapo if they didn't let them do what they would do. That would be a pretty big threat, actually. The Gestapo was not someone you wanted to mess with. They would arrest people, and you didn't have to get a trial. There was no fair trials. They could just throw whoever they wanted in jail or do worse to them. So the Gestapo was an intimidating force, the secret police for the Nazi Party. Also, before we get to Kristallnacht, mention that you had the Hitler Youth Program. Education was taken over by the Nazis, and you were required if you became, I think about 12 years on up, you were required to become a part of the Hitler Youth Program. The boys did a lot of like camping and war games. When we say war games, it would just be for fun, but honestly, they were almost truthfully preparing, a generation of boys to become soldiers. The girls also had their Hitler Youth programs as well, and had to be a part of those as well. And you watched the video and it talked about those. So last thing I will talk about here before we close up, at least with the notes, Kristallnacht, which occurred on the days of November 9th and 10th, primarily at night in 1938. This was the first time that the Nazis openly, now it was already pretty clear that the Nazis did not like the Jewish people and were anti-Semitic. That's obviously clear. I mean, from Hitler's writings back in the 1920s, it's clear. And they had done things to try to slow down Jewish businesses. They had put some Jewish people in concentration camps, but along with communists and other people that they didn't like. And these concentration camps weren't death camps yet. They would become those, but they weren't those yet. But no longer even hiding what their intentions were on these two nights in 1938, there was open destruction of Jewish property. They destroyed 7,500 Jewish businesses, 155 synagogues, and numerous amounts of homes, and killed 35 Jews. This is the first time that the Nazis, in a way that's pretty obvious, began to kill Jewish people, destroy Jewish business. Kristallnacht means night of broken glass, or I think it just means broken glass. Sorry, but that's they were breaking, through all these buildings. So this is the first open, in-your-face move by the Nazis to take out the Jewish people. And it would be less than a year after this that World War II would erupt and begin. So that is it. I've enjoyed having you guys this year. I hope I have all of you guys back next year. Looking forward to some U.S. government and Oklahoma history with you guys. We will have, and I'm going to put this in an email, but you guys will have a test, not a final, but what chapter is this? Sorry, I got to look over here. You will have a chapter 21 test next Monday, the Monday of finals week, which is the 11th. Okay, and I won't have a study guide, but you'll have the notes you've had taken. You'll have your book, and it won't be very long. It might be 25 questions or so. So it's going to be pretty short. But I want you guys to have another test because some of you didn't do that well on the other tests we've had this quarter. Um, there will be no take home portion this time either. It will all be multiple choice or true false. Uh, Possibly there might be a short answer or two, but when they are, it'll be a specific word or two that I'm looking for. That should be pretty obvious to you. So you're going to have that this next Monday. Obviously, your final assignment is due on the 12th, which is the next day. So be working on that. Hope you're doing well on that. Your country you chose. Hope you've gotten a lot of your information. Please don't be procrastinating that off until next Tuesday, and then have to rush it out. Try to work on it a little bit at a time. Trust me, you do that. It's not going to be that much work if you do a little bit at a time. All right. There actually is still one last thing I want you to put on your notes. Hopefully you stay tuned and didn't leave. But I do want to know, what is your favorite snack? So say it's getting a little bit later at night. You obviously don't want to eat a full meal, but you're kind of hungry. What is your go-to snack? Is it something salty? Is it something sweet? And what is that? So that's it. Like I said, this will be the last video. We'll be seeing you guys. Hope you guys are doing well. Hope this stuff ends soon, and hope we can get back to life as normal. We will talk to you guys later. I'm having problems here. All right. Goodbye.